And it looks like we are live once again. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Mission Top. Mission Top is a channel and a place where we try to cultivate philosophia, a love of wisdom, but it's also a farmstead and ranch and a family. And today, in this stream, we are going to explore something that on the surface could seem trivial, which is the symbolic meaning behind the movie Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Decided to do this as something a little more fun today. The last few episodes have been, a little more serious. Yesterday we went way longer than I thought we would with those movies. They were surprisingly popular. In as much as I'm finding, almost anything I do with manhood always attracts more of an audience, especially I think with my subscriber base. But in as much as every day can't be those types of 2-hour experiences, I wanted to go a little bit lighter, but still hopefully provide something of value in the realm of meaning by analyzing this movie. And as I've explained and do regularly explain, but for anybody new that's listening to this, these live streams are rough drafts, if you will, for video essays that I'm planning on making in the future. I'm trying to be in the habit of at least one a week. And so this week I am working on Interstellar, and things are progressing that I should be able to finish it by the end of the week. It'll probably be the longest video essay I've ever done. Probably, a little too long, if you will, but that movie is so jam-packed with meaning that I wanted to lay it all out there and get it out to you. So that is in progress. And this one on Bill and Ted's will be a future one. And it's probably not next week. I have a lot in the lineup in order to do. But I always want to be kind of developing and thinking about a number of movies at any given time. That helps me to kind of deepen whatever I have to eventually say about them. So this live stream is all part of that process. And if you're somebody who cares most about the ideas and doesn't need so much the clips and the music and things like that will come from the video essay, you'll find this kind of discussion and explication interesting. At least I hope. So, Bill and Ted's. This is a movie that has a fond place in my heart. As we're going to get into, it was kind of a culturally significant movie, I think, and one that had some part in the formation of many Xennials. And so we're going to dive into what is an Xennial as far as a generational category and try to see why this movie had an impact and why, underneath these in the substrate of the movie, is there an actual pattern that we can pull out that does align with how the world works and lays itself out. We could go the easy route with the movie and show that it's a hero's adventure story, which it is. You have Bill and Ted who, kind of start out as nobodies, and then this kind of wizard-like person shows up, calls them to adventure. They go on this adventure and then come back, more progressed. So it is that. But I think we're getting to the point in our society where that hero's adventure pattern, and as important as it is, has been, explicated so much that to do it again in this one wouldn't be as useful. So we're not going to look at it from that angle. We could look at it as a chosen one story, in as much as Bill and Ted's, they're presented as the chosen ones, right, who unexpectedly to them, they are the key to the future and whatnot. Very much, stories like Harry Potter and The Matrix and those things, stories that we love. But yeah, we're not going to look at it from that angle because we've have so many of those and so many explications of those kind of things. So we're not going to do that. We could also look at it from the perspective of how it follows that story pattern we talked about yesterday that seems to be like the favorite story pattern of society, which is that starting down, as a nothing, things get better in the course of the movie, right? So you could go from down to up, then things go way down and get really bad, and then they come really back up again. And we love that story pattern. This one has that. But again, I think not the most important angle in order to look at Bill and Ted's. So I think the most important angle that you can look at this story from is as a time travel story. A story about the future, a story about the past, a story about the present. And especially, a story as the past and the future played out or were happening, you could say, because we're going to get into how time I think we're starting to understand doesn't work in terms of, the past is done and in the past, and the future is yet to be in the past. How we can inhabit all three of those things at once, and how at this very moment, this movie shows how those things were being inhabited at the time. Both, collapsing, if you will, of past, present, and future into in a way that you live in all those at one time. We're starting to explore that idea, at least. So let's set this thing up. I tend to go too long sometimes laying out the plot. So let's see if I can go a little bit shorter today. I tried to kind of write out a nice short synopsis so we don't give too much detail that it becomes tedious and boring. So here's my short synopsis, just for those that need a reminder of what this movie was all about. So we have Bill in the story, played by Alex Winter, and Ted, played by Keanu Reeves, who are two guitar-playing teenagers living in San Dimas in Southern California in 1988, trying to get their band Wild Stallions going, right? And they are about to flunk their history class if they can't get an A on their history report, which is due the very next day, which would force Ted to have to go to a military academy in Alaska and separate Bill and Ted and their band forever. So meanwhile, a wise man from the future, from 700 years in the future, San Dimas, this man named Rufus, played by George Carlin, travels back in time in a time machine to San Dimas to announce to Bill and Ted that they are destined to play an important part in the future, right? And bring peace and harmony to the world through their music. So he's there to help them pass their history report so that they won't be separated. And he does this by giving them a time machine, which will allow them to travel back to the past and learn everything they need to know to pass the report, which will allow them to stay together in their band, which will allow them to play the music, which will eventually become the basis of a future peaceful and prosperous society. So in so many ways, this story is just immediately, appears trivial, fun, of course, but trivial. And so on first glance, you're just like, just take it for what it is, Gary, right? Of course, it's just a fun story that means nothing. But I actually think there is something there to this. So let's dive into the meaning of this story. And it's important, in order to understand kind of this meaning, it's important to lay out what the world felt like at this time. And I can actually talk about that because I was there at this time, right there at the end of the 80s into the 90s. And I can tell you what the future was at that time because I was experiencing it. I was even living it out in a way that I'll explain, right? So, you can maybe help me out. Give me in the comments, any of you. I would like to know. I should be asking this more of you as in our kind of chats in the comments. And as we get to that, I'd like to know what generation you see yourselves from, what you see as your formative years when you grew up, because that would help me know you as an audience a bit more. But these were my formative years, right? So I was born in 1982. And so when this came out, I was about 8 years old. And of course, it's not like it's just when this movie comes out that it influences you. I watched it there in my early childhood, 9, 10, into my early teens is when I was watching Bill and Ted. And the world was still staying very much like the world of Bill and Ted. And what was the world like at that time? Well, the world was, at least for a kid, was an exciting, progressing place. At that time, with technology, rapidly coming in all the time, Walkmans and then CDs and things like that. Water parks were this big thing, and it's funny because they play the significant part throughout the Bill and Ted movies. Music and media were just overabundant. Again, with your Walkman, with your CD player, there's this store called Media Play that was just heaven for me. I would go there as much as I can to get my parents to take me there and then hang out there for an hour. And Media Play was great because it had music and video games and movies and books, right? So it was this time of this abundant media where people had money in their pockets to go and enjoy, either the amusements, these new and novel amusements, again, like the water slides, like mini golf and whatnot, or go and spend it, to buy their media, which included video games. And Nintendo, came out when I was part of young. There's all these novel, it's like technology meets even the amusement of food, right? So Slurpees, something like that, it stick out in my mind as, going to 7-Eleven and getting a Slurpee was an important event as a kid. And at the same time, this was, I didn't grow up with any notion of Jimmy Carter and all the problems, Iran-Contra and all that kind of stuff. That was all when I was oblivious. I was growing up there in these kind of prosperous Reagan years, the end of the Cold War, with this notion of America as the shining city on a hill, with patriotic programs that were coming out in elementary school all the time, and then eventually the advent of the internet, coming into people's consciousness. And so it was this time where everything seemed so prosperous, and science and technology lay kind of underneath this prosperity, this progress in terms of technology, but also why there was seemingly good times in terms of money in people's pockets. And so as a kid, if you grow up in that and nothing else, the world seems like a pretty great place. And you can see that that's kind of the upbeat spirit of San Dimas, California, as it's portrayed in this movie. And you've got, the Circle K kind of place, you've got the water park, you've got the mentions of mini golf, of, schools, public schools just kind of running well, and things like that, and a clean, environment, kind of a notion of cleaning things up, right? But underneath the surface, everything was not exactly fine, as you kind of learn now. So this is when the baby boomers were coming of age. They were the parents having the children, and this was this generation. So Bill and Ted are very much the Gen X kind of world and generation in this film. Oftentimes referred to as kind of the latchkey generation, where parents were divorcing left and right. And so again, in this film, you have Bill's parents, obviously have divorced, and his dad's married a much younger woman who was a senior when Bill and Ted were freshmen, and Ted had even asked her, it's Missy, to the prom. So there's this joke thing where Ted thinks that his stepmom is still hot, right? And of course, it's this ongoing joke throughout the whole movie series, the later ones and whatnot. But it's actually had cultural relevance, because that's what was going on, like a tremendous amount of divorce, as no-fault divorce had become popular and whatnot. And so underneath this prosperity and things like that, and how the youth were kind of being left alone, this was not helicopter parenting time. This was time where Gen X was being largely unsupervised, and their parents were kind of falling apart, but they were out in this world with some money in their pockets, eating Slurpees, going to the water park, etc. So there's kind of this prosperity, but underneath it, maybe the foreshadowing of kind of the world that we've come to know, right? Where and now with the boomers, right, who were the parents right there, now they're running the show. We've still got them mainly running all of our institutions. So in that more prosperous kind of way of life, it's important to see what the future was at that next time. And the easiest way to see that for anybody who was there is just to remember kind of what the quintessential vision of the future was, which is in just another form presented right here in Bill and Ted's, and that was Star Trek: The Next Generation, right? The old Star Trek kind of gave this certain kind of romantic vision of the future, but Star Trek: The Next Generation has a very different feel from the original Star Trek series. And I grew up with Star Trek: The Next Generation, and I've seen every episode and watched all of them at the time, growing up. And that's what the future was at the time, right? It was this clean, sleek space where through our technology, through our scientific thinking that allowed us to kind of overcome our human biases, that humans developed this more harmonious way of living with each other and respecting cultures and human life, that's all going to kind of emerge from this more scientific technological thinking, and almost across the board, these futures, just like it is when Bill and Ted's, were always these futures without religion kind of being the most important part of the most glaring absence of that thing. So everything's clean, slick, sparkling, smooth surfaces and whatnot. with an absence of religion, or if there is a religion, then it's something like Bill and Ted presents us. Like there would be this optimistic metal music, that Bill and Ted will produce that becomes the basis of the society, right? But of course, God is kind of out of the picture, essentially. And again, that's how it very much felt growing up in the world, even though I was a religious person, part of a religious tradition that, brought God into life. But, at the same time, it was not an ancient God that you were thinking of. It was this kind of the God of this world of science and technology, who was kind of the God, if any, that still existed, right? And so that this movie that kind of takes place in that zeitgeist, that spirit of the times, if you will, influenced my outlook on the word. And so the generation that I define myself from is an Xennial. As over time, as I would listen to the media kind of growing up in early undergrad and whatnot, you hear Gen X thrown out there, and then eventually, as you got into the 2000s, you would hear about millennials, and you get all this talk about millennials. You're like, and you start learning kind of what are the attributes of these generations. Again, Gen X, I've kind of laid out, had the divorced parents and whatnot. Their music was really important, and kind of all that 90s music that was popular, especially grunge and things like that, was all a little bit bound up with Gen X. But then you had millennials, and of course, the thing that we think of as millennials are these kind of pampered kids, overly idealistic, expect too much, kind of thing. Largely there was an initial very negative look on the millennials and their outlook on life. And I would always sit there and be like, these are not who I am and my generation is, right? And so maybe like 5 years ago or so, somebody wisely pointed out, there's a very there's a very clear in-between generation here of those that aren't Generation X and they're not millennials. So the term was coined Xennials for this kind of generation, where people will put it anywhere from 1980 to about 1985, but a lot of people might even go back as far as 1975. It all depends on where you grew up and kind of what the culture was in your place. Because if you've noticed, things kind of happen a little bit faster in some places of the world and then eventually reach other places. So it all depends on where you were. But I think I see Xennials, or the people that I meet and kind of feel the way that they approach the world, generally are born between 1975, usually after 1977, and then up through about 1985 being about the limit. So all the way from 1975, 1985 is where I would put this generation. And as it turns out, of course, as being part of it, I kind of like this generation, because you don't have as much of the problems, I think, of these other two generations, where on the one hand you grew up with an analog childhood but a digital kind of adulthood, so you weren't inculcated in the digital world and phones your entire life. You got that more usually in late high school or after college. It wasn't until I was out of college that the first iPhone came onto the market, or maybe it came onto the market while I was in law school, I believe. And as well, you don't have this pure over-idealism of the millennials, but you do have an optimism, without some of the pessimism and things like that of Generation X. So again, it's important to see how this movie influenced the outlook, because you can see that the future that is being presented in this movie is very much the future of a generation that was growing up in this prosperity of a certain kind, in terms of material prosperity, scientific, technological prosperity. And so the future looked as it did, this Star Trek kind of future. But then it's important to realize what happened after that, right? And so, for me, I graduated high school. I was part of the class of 2000, and that's another thing about being an Xennial. You had this kind of right in the middle of the Xennials, you have this high school class that comes of age, you could say, 18 years old or whatnot, and right there at the birth of a new millennium. And, the scientific way of looking at the world would say, well, that's completely arbitrary. There's nothing meaningful in that. But that's not how it felt to me. And I've tried to talk to other members of this generation to see if they felt that there was a significance, that you were coming of age, right there at the dawn of a new millennium. And, some people report, no, I just didn't even think about it. But other people report, yeah, this strikes you, this calls out as being meaningful. And that's how meaning works, we see patterns of meaning in the world. And when a millennia turns over, right, there's something meaningful about that. And so I always felt that that was some, I don't know, some call to say that you need to do something in this world. Like the world's going to change. And funny enough, it did shortly thereafter. And because you're coming of age right now at this turn, you're supposed to do something about it in your life. Because the change is actually not going to be for the better. And so that's always the sense that I grew up with. And so right there, at 2000, right at the turn of the millennium, some things started happening. That was when the tech bubble burst, right? And then September 11th happened in September 2001, and the world completely changed, right? The war in Iraq followed shortly thereafter, and if you can remember back to the tensions and the divisions that got brought into society at that time, it completely changed this vision of the world that is presented in the world of Bill and Ted's, and the future that it presents as well. Right, the recession came in 2007, right as again the kind of this Xennial first millennial generation was entering the workplace, making it a difficult environment, and that right there is when the future and all the movies and the stories started changing very dystopic, right? Of course, we've always had dystopia type movies, but for a while there, that's like the only kind of future that could be imagined, because that's how the future was being influenced by the present at that moment. And so we're going to get into how this all comes into the time travel narrative of Bill and Ted's. There was, of course, some prosperity in the early 2010s. That's when I built my businesses with my business partner, and they did well. Or business partners, but then we started getting to this present world that we're now in, that was all kind of building up to 2016, Donald Trump, and the way that the world again felt like it fundamentally changed, in my opinion, mostly for the worst in there. That's when trans issues blew up, Jordan Peterson, and also those things just stewed leading up to 2020, where of course we have the pandemic in 2020. And so the thing that I'm trying to show you is how the events of that, as they played out, have fundamentally altered the future as compared to the future of Bill and Ted's. And if we can understand that, we can start to understand how time and the way that we inhabit it, we are always in the future, we are always in the past, in a sense. Because if you haven't noticed in our present environment, look how much effort is being given to altering the past, right? One of my favorite examples is the 1619 project that was in the New York Times, I think there in 2019, where a big fundamental effort was being made to shift people's mindset to see that the fundamental event of the founding of the United States, you could say, was the arrival of the first slave ship. And to see that as the seed event that colors and influences and impacts every event of history before. Well, you'd say, well, the past is the past. The everything's fixed in the past. You can't change it. Look how much effort was being put to change the past there. And if you can change the past, you can change the future as well. So these are all principles I'm trying to bring in to show you how time is not exactly what we've thought it as. We've inhabited the whole world thinking of things scientifically, and if you think of that way in terms of time, you just kind of think of it in terms of Einstein and relativity and the arrow of time, which is useful in somewhat. But in the meantime, our stories, especially our time travel movies, are trying to show us that the meaning of the events of the past and the future are actually the more important thing, the narrative of the past and the future. And so understanding that, again, will help us now be able to unpack Bill and Ted's and say what is the main meaning that was there. and how do we then today gain the future that we want? Okay. And just to kind of do one more thing, and this is a little bit experiment today, I've actually got the clip that shows kind of the time where Bill and Ted go into the future, because it's one of my favorite like all-time clips in terms of let's say cinema. And again, just because it's Bill and Ted's, and so it's trivial feeling in a sense, but this clip so much conveys what the future was. And here's where you're going to have to help me out, because this is the first time I've ever run a clip, using the streaming software that I am. And so it doesn't play the music for me, although I'm getting indications that the music is playing in this. And so I need you to tell me, if you could, if the music is coming through as I play this clip. And of course, right now at this moment, YouTube is giving me a warning that the stream's bit rate is lower than it should be. So hopefully that recovers. But anyway, I'm going to go for it. Who knows, maybe this will, break the stream, or there's copyright issues or something like that. But I'm going to try it out, because if I know that I can stream video clips complete with sound on here, I can make future streams more interesting. So I'll start that, and if you could tell me in the chat, especially like Christian, I would appreciate it if you could do that. Let me know if you can see this clip, which again portrays in such an effective way the notion of the future at the time of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure coming out. Okay, so again, if anyone, or maybe Christian, if you'd let me know if you're getting the clip, and also if you can hear the sound on it.
I don't know. Sure do play excellent music. Most outstanding.
Okay, looks like Sarah finally let me know that it is working.
It's us.
So that's good to know. We'll use more of these clips in the future, but just enjoy this one. It's only a couple minutes.
Want us to say something. What should I say? Make something up. Be excellent to each other. Party on, dudes! Good one, dude. Well, gotta get back to our report. Yeah, we take you with us, but it's a history report, not a future report. Later. Later. Let's get back and do our report. Good idea.
Okay, there we go. So, to me, one of the finest moments of cinema history right there. And I hope you enjoyed that as much as I do. Maybe it's just me and you think I'm weird. But there's something about that, the music, and again, that vision of the future, because that was the future when I was growing up. Like, that was the future I lived in. And I told you that it was even the one I lived out. I've mentioned this maybe once before, but my first job, actually my second, it was a paperboy first, but my first job was at this space center, this elementary school, where this very visionary teacher had gotten this grant from Apple. He'd sent them this proposal to build a simulator, where he got a bunch of Apple computers, got designed some software on them to make it look like Star Trek spaceship controls on them, put up a projector and had big subwoofer sound music going, and basically created the deck of a Star Trek ship, and elementary school kids would come in and live out a mission in the Star Trek universe, complete with the captain and people firing the weapons and people doing the communications and stuff. And so I went to this a couple times, and when I was in 4th and 5th grade, and again, this was the world, this was the future. This was the time of NASA, and when NASA was big, and space shuttles and all that, and that was the future, right? And so going and be able to live out the future, participate in that story, I mean, it was heaven for a kid. And then I was able to get a job, first volunteering there and then working there as a paid employee, where you actually get to kind of facilitate these missions of kids coming in. And again, my job was to study Star Trek, if you will, the next generation. So I got quite knowledgeable in the Star Trek Next Generation world. But anyways, in as much as you realize that was the future at the time, I want you to see how much the future has changed. That is not the future that we envision anymore. Contrast it if you've seen the Netflix series Dark, for instance, kind of the vision of the future in that, where so many visions are just this apocalyptic, ugly version of the future. Or maybe if you're kind of more in a progressive ideology, and you hope that what's been being called woke ideology, if you think that's the future and everything's going to come to fruition, what that kind of all-inclusive, everything permitted kind of future might look like to some people. But it's not this one that we just saw necessarily. That was something very end of the 80s, early 90s type of future. So understanding that, let's now get into these time travel stories and into Bill and Ted's, and finally kind of pull out the fundamental meaning of this movie that I think's there. Christian mentioned that I love time travel movies. In a sense, I do, but the reason why I keep on talking about time travel movies is because society keeps on making them, right? And that's one of these things I want you to realize that had started already back in the time of Bill and Ted's. Of course, there was Back to the Future before that. And you can go back to all the way to, I think, maybe the first time travel story was, The Time Machine by, you'll have to help me remember the author. Was it Jules Verne or somebody else who wrote the Time Machine movie that was a little bit older book? But we've been telling these time stories for a long time. But notice how, ever since Back to the Future and whatnot, if anything, our time travel stories, and there's different kinds, there's kind of Groundhog Day ones where you're repeating a day. There's several movies like that, but usually it's that you travel either into the past or into the future, and doing so impacts the rest of the timeline, right? So in those, I focus on time travel movies because I'm looking at our society focusing on them, and that tells me there's something that we see as significant in them. And you can just say, well, the thing that about time travel movies is just they're kind of convenient narrative devices where you can kind of look at different possibilities and how they'd play out, and it's interesting, and so you can just see it as a means of creating interest in stories. But I think there's a meta reason, right? We keep on telling these time travel stories, and those of you that have listened to me a while will know some of my main ideas on that. But that's because I think that we're, in terms of maybe not as to the events of the past and the future, which may very well be fixed. There's some people that argue for that, but we cannot. So maybe we can't change the events of the past or the future, but we can definitely change the meaning of the past and the future, right? And as we change the meaning in either of those, it impacts the present, it impacts the past to change the meaning of the future. It impacts, if we change the meaning of the past, it changes the meaning of the present and the future as well. So you have to ask yourself, what's actually most important in the way that you experience life? Kind of the facts or the physical events happening around you, or the meaning of what's going on around you in your life? And at least for me, the answer is that the meaning actually shines out as far more important to the way that we experience the world than are the events as they happen. It's how we perceive the events and the facts that are always going around us, how we organize the facts, which things we choose to pay attention to. That shapes our world far more than, again, the physical events. And so if you can make that step with me, then you'll see how if we do have control over the meaning of the past and the future at all times, and so that means we can live and affect the past and the future, at least the most important part of it, right? The meaning of the past and the future. And those things will impact our lives and the way we experience it right now. So that's why I think we keep on telling time travel stories, because that's what's always happening in them, right? People are playing with the narrative, and a narrative is bound up, a story is bound up with the meaning part of life. And so we're trying to change the story in order to produce some better story that we want. So knowing that, again, let's look back at Bill and Ted's, and that's exactly what it's proposing. From the very first image in the movie, it's Rufus there saying that there's this excellent future that has been created, right? They say bowling scores are way up and mini golf scores are way down, because of course that's the beautiful future. But that future can only be created by events in the past. And so he goes back and gives Bill and Ted this time machine in order to pass the report. So Bill and Ted need to become the future, if you will, right? They need to be the people that will create the music that will create this future. But in order to do that, what do they have to do? And here's where, this fundamental meaning comes into Bill and Ted's. They actually have to go back into the past in order to create the future, if that makes sense, right? And so that's actually true. That's a sound pattern of meaning that in this silly movie actually makes fundamental sense and is something you and I can actually do, right? So if we want to create an ideal future, whatever that may be, we can argue about that, then this movie is telling us you have to actually go back and inhabit the past, all right? Again, maybe not the events of the past, but the meanings of the past. And so how do you do that? Well, in this story, it's a time machine, but there are various forms of time machines around us in our life. Of course, one would be these things that I'm always pulling out and having around me right here. These are time machines right here, right? Books, because the written word was established in the past, and here it has traveled up to the present. So I can get the very same words that were there in the past here into the present, and it can put me back into that past environment, if you will. The same thing, another way that I think we can do that is through the monuments, the artifacts that our ancestors have left us. And so you could say, you just mean like archaeology and things like that. Yes, in a sense, but I'm more talking about the sacred artifacts, the temples, the standing stones of innumerable varieties, the things that they marked off as of being important and that kind of contain information. And as much as you can see, like even Stonehenge, just this very act of putting a stone and placing it in a vertical direction imbued that stone with meaning and information, and hence millions of people still go there every year in order to kind of try to discern the meaning that was sent from the past up into the future, right, by our ancestors. So those are two ways we can inhabit the past. But at the end of the day, it's as much learning about who the people were of the past, diving back into the lives of your ancestors, but not just your ancestors. In Bill and Ted's, you're diving back, and who are you trying to kind of commune with back in the past? Who do Bill and Ted go and find? They find, the titans, the giants of the past, you could say, the gods of the past. Like they would put it, Socrates, Beethoven, Sigmund Freud, right? Of course, I'm saying their mind all wrong, because that's part of the joy of the movie is how oblivious they are. But yeah, Socrates and things like that, he is a titanic figure of the past. And so just yesterday, I was listening to one of my favorite thinkers, you guys know, John Vervaeke, who was talking about how we have one of the ways to cultivate wisdom, to be a wise person, is that we can internalize the sages of the past, right? So you can go and you can learn who Socrates is by reading the works of Plato and learning this Socratic method, how Socrates was kind of this process of looking at the world and dialoguing, you could say, with the world. And so seeing who Socrates was, you can also read his story about his trial, for instance, and the way that he willingly accepted death because he saw it as the most appropriate way for him to live and continue living, for his spirit to live on. Well, once you learn that about Socrates, you can actually internalize Socrates, right? And so notice this is what Bill and Ted's presents. You go back in the past, you commune with these people, and you can actually take them back with you into the future. Again, it's a sound pattern of meaning. And they can actually then be there with you in the present. Socrates can be here with you. You can internalize the sage of Socrates and look at the world in terms of how this person would see the world. Okay, so in the story, that's what the report is supposed to be about. What would these historical figures think about San Dimas? And of course, all of them loved it because it was this great and prosperous time, and that's part of, again, the fun of them presenting their final report in the movie. But the pattern of meaning is sound, in as much as you can internalize Abraham Lincoln, right? Or you learn about Freud's ideas and whatnot. And actually, we have internalized Freud. You have this idea of the unconscious, right? Guess where you got that from? The way that you think about the unconscious and you use it as an internalized feature of the way that you understand the world. It was from Freud, right? And so that is how it is from. So if you want to, going back to the structure, if you want to create the ideal future, you actually need to go back into the past and inhabit the past with the, you choose who it's going to be with, wherever the gods that you want to commune with of the past. This one has Genghis Khan and Joan of Arc and stuff, but of course there's innumerable gods of the past you can inhabit, or your ancestors who, given the fact that you're more connected with your ancestors, you can commune with them, learn their stories, and then remember that they are part of you, right? And so you already have carried part of them up into the future with you. Your ancestor who courageously left his hometown in Europe to travel to the new world of the Americas and found a new life that eventually ended up being you. You can internalize then that story and say, yeah, that's part of that dude is part of me. And now I can have him living with me, communing with me, his spirit, all the time. And it then shapes the way that I see this world, the present world, and it also shapes the possibilities that I see in the future. The future appears different once you have these kinds of spirits, you could say, living with you, internalizing them, is the way I would put it. There's a very easy way that a lot of people already do this, without even thinking about it, and that's that people, in common Christian religion are always asking, what would Jesus do, right? Because you can actually try to inhabit the world as you understand Jesus, and then look back out at the world, having tried to internalize Jesus and how Jesus looks at the world. And as you look at the world through Jesus' eyes, the world is different, and you interact with the world in a different way. You interact with the world as Jesus would, and then the world gets better, right? And in as much as the world gets better, you're influenced again by the world, and it changes you. So it's like this ongoing process of how you change the world and it changes you and you change the world, and hopefully That's to spiral up a process of betterment. But see, the thing about it is that this same kind of thing can happen, but in a negative way, right? You can do that. You can internalize other kinds of spirits that shape your world into a progressively worse world until you have created, in essence, a prison around you. And that's much how addiction works. It's this kind of ongoing relationship between you and the world where things get more and more constrained, where only a certain course of action, taking the addictive substance or whatnot, becomes the world that you have created around you, because you internalized that spirit which constrained your possibilities, right? So again, from a very trivial movie, we now know why we like it, why it's a movie that at least I will come back to, and I'll watch it every few years and enjoy it, not just because it's funny, but because I feel something sound at the heart of it. It's a pattern that I like to remind myself of, this Bill and Ted's movie, as silly as it is. And in fact, the other ones did an okay job too. Like the second one was the worst of the three, but it had this notion of, you have to kind of go through hell to get through heaven kind of notion. And again, that's a sound pattern. It at least works, although it was executed the least well. And then this most recent Bill and Ted's movie also has some sound symbolic patterns maybe we can get into at another time. But what's cool is that you can see how, even the fun, trivial things of the world might have meaning in them, which you, over time, can start to see and then enjoy those things or benefit from them in even a greater way, okay? And they shape you, and they do the same thing as we were just talking about. These kind of stories, once you see the patterns of meaning in them, they remind you and get you back into those patterns. Because now hopefully you leave this today thinking to yourself, how could I do that? How could I delve back into the past and try to commune with some sort of spirit inhabiting the past, you could say, internalize that spirit, bring it up into my life here in the present, look at the present through those eyes, and through doing that, change the very way that I see the future to be a better future. From watching Bill and Ted's, you can actually do that. And that's what I think is so amazing and potent about stories. Two more little just symbolic things that also worked for me at the same time is that are less important, but at least worth mentioning, is that the way that this future is presented, that Bill and Ted, their music is what becomes the basis of the future. There's something worth thinking about that as well, okay? Because think about the way that you experience music. Music is very different because so many things we do in our life in order to kind of get the end result out of it, right? So we go to work in order to get that paycheck is the primary reason we do it, right? In order to have something. And so so many of the processes of life are just kind of manipulations of the world in order to get some, use some tool to get some benefit or some specific thing that we want about it. But music is kind of like that, but it's also fundamentally different in that when you're listening to music, it's not about getting through the song to the end of the music, right? The end is kind of irrelevant. You listen to the beginning and you experience the music, and it's great. And you listen to the middle, and it's not like you're kind of missing the beginning again and hoping for the end. Sometimes there's favorite parts in there. Yeah, you can quibble. But for the most part, when you're listening to music, you're just experiencing the process of listening to music. And it's not about accomplishing anything other than kind of communing, if you could say, with the music wherever you are in it. Like watching a dance is very much the same kind of thing. As you're watching a dance, it's not about the dance getting to the end and finishing the dance, because it produces something out of the dance. So you're not like anticipating, this is going to get to the end. As the dance is happening, every part of the dance is something that you appreciate. So take that notion and apply it to our notions of the future. Like a lot of the future, the way that people construct it in their minds is that we finally figured out the right things, the right propositions, the right way to look at God that finally defines God in the right way, that everybody will believe in God, or something like that, or we finally got the right political system operating, and if only my political system that I like is the one that's right, and if only everybody would agree to that political system, then we'd have the ideal future. But I think Bill and Ted's, again, fundamentally gets something right as to its vision of the future, that maybe something more like music would be the fundamental principle of a more ideal, better society, a society that wasn't so in conflict with each other. Because that would mean that the process of life, it's that, kind of the process of becoming. It's not arriving at any certain thing. It would be more like, I think the best way of putting it, as far as like human development, the process of becoming better humans, and not any end state, any particular goal would be what this society is about, but the very process of becoming something better. If that lie beneath society as its fundamental principle, well, that's one of those things that we've talked about in the past in the metagame kind of principle. That is super abundant. You can't exhaust that thing. You can't exhaust a process. It doesn't eat up resources in this way that the way we structured our society today does, where if somebody has the oil, other people don't, so you have to fight over it. If somebody has the particular resource, you have, if you start seeing the fundamental process as like human flourishing, human development, then everyone can participate in that. And the more that anyone participates in it, especially as it benefits other people, or the more somebody produces human flourishing, by and large, like the more you want of it. That person hasn't taken away anything of the world. He's only enhanced something that has no bottom, right? Sometimes I think that I'm talking about these two things too abstractly, and they make sense to me and they might not to you. But yeah, the essence of it is to see that this movie might be proposing that the fundamental principle of the future, is something more like a process rather than an end state. And if we can get our mindset into that, then you're not thinking that the future has to arrive at some certain thing. Instead, it's more of a trajectory that the future has, if that makes any sense as well. Okay, so that's the second thing that I think this movie contains, and for what it's even worth mentioning, that you saw there in the clip, and it's the one that's here by my head. You have this notion in their silly slogan, be excellent to each other. And Bill says that, and notice he's on the right. That's the right hand on life, kind of this notion of excellence and confining ourselves into an ordered set of what defines quality or excellence. That's the right hand of life, right? And then Ted, what's the other side of life? Party on, dudes, which is this notion of party, of recreation, of kind of a loosening, a more loosening. A party, is a place where the rules come down of regular life, right? And so again, in this silly movie, you have some of these sound concepts that is also that is how you attain this process that I was just talking about. It's this proper balance of an ordering process, that you always maintain enough stability in society or in yourself at any given time. At the same time, you're honoring this process of renewal, recreation at the same time. And so once again, in a silly movie, you have some sound symbolic concepts being presented to you in a very fun form, and hence the enjoyment of the movie. So I think that's what I got out of it. That's what I understood about it. So that's all I have to say about this movie today. Looking back at the chat, thanks Chase for letting me know that the clip worked. And Christian, Gary, you say, Gary, this kind of message from you about time travel stories, especially from your Coca video, has inspired me to interview my grandfather about his story and experiences in the Rhodesian Bush War. That's about the best thing I could ever think about this, right? Because there you are capturing that story. I mean, even if whether you write it down or not, that will become part of you, and a way that you will forever after then have, right? Yeah, the spirit of your grandfather with you. That's fantastic, because it means that, yeah, I'm not just blabbing here, but maybe this stuff that I'm blabbing about actually has an effect in the world, and hopefully for the better. So Christian, thank you for sharing that with me. And that's a perfect example of what all of us can do to apply these kinds of principles. Amon says, shoot for the moon. If you miss it, you will still land among the stars. Yeah, I mean, I like that as a thing. Once you see that it's the process, that's the important part, of course, that brings mistake into its proper focus. And like, this is where I see it in a Christian context, but this is my concept of the way, if you will. Like, if you see that it's not arriving at any end state, like, if I follow these commandments, then I am a good person. But rather you say, look, I'm heading out towards the godly ideal, which for a lot of Christians would be Jesus. You study the life of Jesus, you try to head towards the ideal of Jesus. Right, you shoot for the moon, as you say it was, but in the very process, on an ongoing basis, on the ongoing cycles of a week per se, you make mistakes. You miss the mark. That's what sin is, right? You miss the mark, but guess what? In all the traditions I know, it says that doesn't matter if you're doing it in the right way. If you're in the way, in that process, the process was what matters. So the sins don't matter. So even if you miss the mark, you got somewhere closer, and so all you have to do is then reorient, change direction. That's called repentance, right? You have to repent, head back towards the mark, and boom, you're back in the way. And in as much as you're able to be in the way, when you're in the way, that's where I would say that's when you're in heaven. Heaven is not, again, a state, a goal to get to, that, if I do all the right things in this life, then after this life, I'll be in heaven. It's more that if you're in the right process in this life, the right state of being, then you're already in heaven, because all the rewards come. That's the state of flow, the state of feeling progress and whatnot. And if you can do it with other people and commune with other people in that state of progress, even better, right? And so, yeah, Amon, in your phrase that you just put there, I think all those principles and the way that they very much apply to this, these same things. So Sarah, my wife, who, thank you for listening, Sarah, and you never are obligated, says, I hope that Gary being able to draw meaning from the most simple of movies like this one helps everyone appreciate that we never just watch a movie here at the Nuila home, which is exactly right. Yeah, we have to, of course, even if not in a formal way, I usually end up forcing people to think about it with me. So if you ever come and watch a movie with me, that may be the price you have to pay. But that's the thing, like, a lot of people, we trivialize stories, right? In an ancient sense, I wonder if stories were ever told just for like a notion of entertainment. I'm sure to a sense there is, because we get so much fulfillment out of stories, but I want to say that in a more sacred world, a story would have always been recognized that a story can only be a story and hold itself together as something interesting that holds our attention if it has a pattern of meaning to it. So even the most trivial stories, if we find ourselves paying attention to them, there's something there. And it's worth saying, well, what's there? What's the pattern that's there? And can I take out that pattern? Can I apply it to my life? Like, to me, that's what I like, that, right? It's what the enjoyable part of life is, because it holds the possibility, you could say, of finding new patterns or new slight variations of patterns that help you then in some other aspect of life. And just think about how, a story is not just a sequence, a chronology of facts. Because if, I was telling you the story of making, the story of my morning, and I said, I lifted up the fork 2 inches, and then brought it in a arc of an angle to my mouth. I chewed 3 times. I put the fork down. I looked to the right in the room. Already you're like, you're bored. It's not facts and a sequence of facts and a chronology that makes a story. It's a pattern of meaning. And so, the bad stories you watch and you can't even watch them. You turn on some brain melting kids weird show, and there's so many out there today. And I can't watch it for 5 seconds. And turn this off. There's nothing there. But then there's other stories, right? That even Bill and Ted kind of stories that you find yourself, I'm interested in it again. I've got to come back. And if you're doing that and you haven't feel like you've plumbed the depths of that story again, that's where I think it's useful to do this, what I've been doing today with the story, and say, there's something here. There's a pattern. There's a pattern of living that has to do, with a pattern of meaning that is tied up with how the world works. And in as much as I can understand how the world works, I can understand reality itself. The more in touch I can be with reality, usually the more fulfilled we feel. Those are those feelings of awakeness, enlightenment, etc., that are all bound up with meaning and fulfillment in life. So, story, at least to me, is never just a story. And with that, it looks like we've kind of exhausted this subject for today. I hope it was useful to you and you found value in it. And I hope when this finally gets turned in to its final version, it will be something potent and valuable to you as well. And I thank you for giving me the opportunity to try to articulate these thoughts, because that's what it takes for me to then be able to put them in a more concise 15 or 10 minute package where we cover all the things we just covered, but more potently and in a way that doesn't take up so much people's time and attention, which of course a lot of people don't have. So with that, this is Gary signing off from Mission Top for today. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, and sometime this week, probably more towards the end, we'll finally release this video essay I've been working on for some time on Interstellar. Thanks for being here, and have a great rest of your day wherever you are in the world.